Hey, it's Bobby, and I just got back from a Garden State Homebrewers meeting where I presented this topic on getting dialed in with your recipes. And I thought I would record a voiceover real quick so that maybe some people who didn't get to make the meeting can enjoy this content as well as anybody who stumbles on it on my YouTube channel. The topic is getting dialed in, or my recipe life cycle, and this was originally presented in August of 2025. This is going to be a high-level look at just one brewer's process for taking a recipe from conception to competition medals, and that's obviously the goal for me. Anybody who wants to compete with their beer kind of depends on recipes and tweaking them to become better if they're not amazingly lucky on the first go-ahead. We're going to look at some recipe resources. We'll talk about software, not specific software packages that we recommend or anything like that, but just the fact that using software is almost a mandatory aspect of this topic. We'll also talk about recording and note-taking throughout the brewing process, critical sensory evaluations, and then finally recipe tweaking concepts, which I think most people just wanted to jump to right away, but there's kind of a lot to talk about here. First, disclaimer, I want you to relax and potentially don't worry. I don't think that recipe creation and tweaking is necessarily for everyone. Sometimes you just want to get a recipe kit from your homebrew shop and just brew it, or maybe just experiment and goof around with some ingredients and not really take it all that seriously. So these are the overall recipe resources that I wanted to talk about. It's always a good idea to start with a vetted recipe for your first go ahead at any given beer style. Okay, the first one I recommend is Brewing Classic Styles. This is like the original of all of the recipe books that people use. Jamil Zainasheff and John Palmer put together this great book. So it's getting a little bit old. It was originally published in 2007, so it's encroaching on 20 years old. Some of the BJCP styles are discontinued, and a lot of the language around those styles have changed a couple of times since then. And even some of the ingredients have been discontinued or they are harder to find. For example, some of the base grain specific malt extracts in this recipe book have been discontinued by Brew, for example. So you can no longer get Vienna and Munich specific liquid malt extracts from them. And so it will require some substitutions. It's less true for the all grain conversion recipes that are also in this book. So just keep in mind, it is getting a little bit older, but you can brew one of these recipes directly out of this book and be perfectly happy with them. The next one is Gordon Strong's Modern Homebrew Recipes. Gordon Strong was a 3-time Ninkasi Award winner, and just by default, that means he has good recipes. I haven't personally taken many of the recipes out of this book because it came out when I kind of already had established my own process for coming up with recipes. I'm going to appeal to authority and say that if you're looking for a recipe book, this is probably a good bet. Next, subscribe to BYO and Zymergy magazines, and there are some specific editions of these or issues of these magazines that are specifically geared towards recipes, and those are always interesting. A more recent or modern source of recipes would be Matt Harold's Mean Brews project, and he grabs data from a bunch of recipe sources, but they're all vetted recipes that have won medals in different comps, and he uses some analytics to sort of engineer a recipe. And while I'm talking about the process of analyzing winning recipes and coming up with new recipes based on trends, I should give some credit to somebody who I think did this originally, and that's Ray Daniels. And I had his book, Designing Great Beers, probably over a decade ago, and that's exactly what that book was attempting to do, was looking back at a lot of the winning recipes and showing trends in different ingredient uses I've used a lot of the Mean Brews content on YouTube for specific styles I was trying to brew to get an idea of trends. But I should warn you that I did brew a couple of the recipes as is and had limited success with those. I don't always think you can math your way into a great recipe. I think it's one of the resources that is helpful, and I'll just say that. One thing you can do is check out the brewery websites for your favorite beers. So we can get pretty close. At least we know some of the ingredients that are going to be put into the recipe, and we can start from that and use some intuition to kind of figure out what the balances are. And that also plays into how recipe software can maybe help us out, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The other one is pretty interesting, is watching videos of brewery tours or going on a brewery tour yourself. If you scan that QR code there, you'll see that there was a little sneak peek at a brewer's clipboard at a famous brewery, and I did use that recipe with some success, so check that one out. Okay, another recipe resource is your favorite homebrew shop, Brew Hardware. My recipes that win medals at any given competition are how I figure out the all grain kits. When I medal with a recipe, I immediately turn it into a kit. I don't hold any of my recipes secret. I don't change my recipe when it becomes a kit to make it less expensive or to hide some detail about it. My intention is not to make my customers less successful in competitions, even if those customers are competing against me in the future. I don't recommend doing searches for recipes in the cloud of any of the brewing software. Like, I know that shown on the screen is what it looks like to get recipes in the recipe library on Brewfather. You really don't know how successful they've been. So use it cautiously or not at all. Let's talk about software specifically for recipe management. Now, one of the most important things that recipe software will do is it captures your brewing system and all of its parameters and saves it as a profile. So the reason why the profile is important is that if you're creating recipes from scratch in the software, or if you're importing recipes from outside sources, it's all in reference to your system profile so that you can look at what all the parameters are going to end up being, like the color, the gravity, the bitterness, all of that. You'll see a lot of people who are relatively new to all grain brewing saying that I didn't hit my numbers and trying to figure out what went wrong. And what went wrong was taking someone's external recipe, not reconfiguring the recipe to adapt it or to scale it to your system. So when somebody says I didn't hit my numbers, what they're really saying is I didn't hit someone else's numbers. You create a brewing system profile, and then you look at recipes through that lens from now on. Moving on to slide 13, another aspect of software usage is batch management. So it helps you prep for your brew day and then execute the brew day. So it will do things like calculate the appropriate amount of yeast to pitch into a given batch, and that's based on the recipe parameters. It'll also help you calculate how to grow up a yeast starter if you don't have enough yeast in a single pack. Also, water volumes, the mash schedules with temperatures and timers for your mash and your boil hop additions, and then ultimately logging of all your critical measurements throughout your brew day and the cellaring of that beer. Now, another aspect of software and its importance is the fact that it offers a place to take notes and use it as a reference point for when you plan to brew it again. My best advice is to record anything and everything about the batch while it's fresh. So while you're going through the brew day, whenever there's a little downtime where you're not actively touching something, you should be touching a pen or typing on your keyboard to take notes. What did you do? What were you trying to do? What mistakes were made? Anything you can think of, just write it down. Maybe it's going to be relevant after you taste the beer again, you can't know what parameters and things are important while they're happening. You really should just record them. And when you're going back and doing some research on a previous recipe and trying to figure out what went wrong, then you'll find your great notes and you'll thank yourself. One little chart here that I wanted to show you is this concept of recipe and batch revisions that a lot of software helps you track. So just as an example, the blue boxes are your recipe files and the red boxes are your batch files. And so you have recipe version 1 that you brew and you turn that into recipe V1 batch 1. And then let's say you brew it again with absolutely no revisions. That would end up being recipe V1 batch 2. And then after tasting batch 2, maybe you want to make some tweaks. Maybe you want to make the beer darker, higher original gravity, or whatever that tweak may be. You go and change the recipe to V2 and then you brew that. So you could see how you kind of get this flow chart where you can have a single recipe that you execute over and over again with no changes, or you can do some recipe revisions based on feedback. So this is critical sensory evaluations. It's really important that when your beer is ready to drink that you sit down with it in isolation and taste it like you were judging it in a competition. You want to think about what changes you would make to the beer if you could. Try not to think about all of the challenges. Don't think about the wasted time that maybe you spent brewing a beer that you don't really care for. Just think about what you would change with what you're tasting and smelling in the beer right in front of you, and take really good notes about that in the software. So it really captures your impression of the beer in the glass, and that's going to be important when you're really thinking about a rebrew and how you would change things. Next, you should be asking your homebrew club members for specific feedback and write down what they say. And then ultimately, to be trusted even a little bit more, would be submitting beers into a competition that at least BJCP sanctioned judges will be tasting and giving you anonymous feedback. Judges are at least vetted to be competent in tasting certain things in beer, as well as being able to communicate those descriptors, and they also have no idea who you are. So they're not avoiding hurting anyone's feelings or propping up their friends or whatever it may be. Let's get into the concept of tweaking recipes now. One of the most important things is to just learn how to affect the change that your sensory evaluations are guiding you towards. One of the most important parts of beer or recipe design, assuming that everything went as planned, is just how to tweak the balance of the beer. You have to think about sweetness and malty character. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're kind of on the same side of the balance spectrum. And how they get balanced by hop bitterness or tannins such as oak, acids as well. So you might have a beer that is too sweet or malty because it's not quite bitter enough, or tannic or acidic. So there's so many different ways of approaching the balance of a beer, and you have to learn what those vectors are and how to affect them. Another thing is avoid making some of the amateur recipe design mistakes. One of them is to just really use too many different malts. Sometimes when people start getting into recipe design and tweaking, they look at the malt section of a homebrew store like a kid in a candy store, and they just want to start grabbing a little of this and a little of that. I call these kitchen sink beers. Sometimes they come out great, but it's hard to really know what you want to change about a beer when there's 12 different malts in it. The other one is just using too much crystal or caramel malts. You need to be looking at the manufacturer or the maltster's spec sheets on these grains, and they'll list a maximum usage percentage. The important thing to know, though, is that whenever they're talking about something like a crystal malt, like a 20 Lovabond crystal malt, if they say maximum usage 10%, they mean for the entire batch's collection of crystal or caramel malt. So just be careful. There are a lot of malt names that say caramel, some of them say crystal, and then some of them have proprietary names that begin with Cara, Cara Vienne, Cara Munich. All of those Cara malts are also crystal malts. So you can't have 10% of crystal 20L and then 10% of special B, which is also a crystal malt, and then 10% of Cara Munich. Now you got 30% of crystal malts, and it is a sweet caramel bomb. So just be careful. Another example that's just not listed here is Victory Malt and Biscuit Malt and Special Roast Malt. Those are all biscuit malts. So if you're stacking them based on their slightly different names, but they are all biscuit malts. So just make sure that you're not doubling and tripling down on them just under a different name. The next thing I want you to consider doing is this process of bench testing your beers. So pour a bunch of sample glasses and sit down at a table and start doctoring each of the samples with different additives. Some of the different things you're going to do is lower and raise the pH. You're going to try adding chloride. You're going to try sweetening it. You're going to do some bittering or thickening or thinning. And all of these different additions will help you learn what these directions will do to the flavor and impression of the beer. So I mostly look at bench testing as a way of understanding what can be done to a beer on the next brew of that recipe. So let's say, just for instance, that you've identified that the beer is too sweet or has too much body. There's several things you can do to counterbalance that. One would be to add some simple sugar to the boil, and that would be like table sugar or corn sugar, and you can make your wort more fermentable that way. That's especially helpful if you're brewing extract where you can't make any mash temperature modifications, and it's pretty common if you want to just thin out a beer, just go ahead and add like a pound of table sugar to the boil. If you're brewing all grain, instead of adding sugar to the boil, you could just mash a few degrees cooler, which will make that wort more fermentable. You can also increase your bitterness or higher IBUs in the overall recipe. Another thing to be careful about is to make sure that you're watching the alpha acid percentage that's listed on the hops package that you buy. And if it's different than the recipe design, just make sure that you're scaling it up or down so that your IBUs actually end up more consistent to the recipe. Also, you can use a yeast strain with a higher attenuation range. There are a lot of different yeast strains that will attenuate more or less than others. And all of the yeast manufacturers list those specs on their product descriptions. Also, make sure that your pH isn't too high. Adding acidity to a beer will brighten it up and make it less sweet and round. You can also increase your sulfate or reduce your chloride to sharpen it up. So that'd be like adding gypsum to the water. And then also be sure that you don't have a diacetyl problem. In low quantities, it doesn't really taste like diacetyl or smell like it, but it can add this sort of buttery like mouthfeel to the beer that some people interpret as too sweet or full-bodied. I'm going to go through this one quickly because it's the exact opposite. If the beer is too thin or watery, do all of the opposite things that I just described. Getting into a homebrew club is extremely helpful to get your recipes tweaked. You can ask all of your peers. Most people are extremely generous with their recipes and they'll definitely help you out. The other thing is, I think most clubs do this where everybody brings a beer to share, or some people do anyway. If you find one that you really like, or if you're tasting a flavor that you're not used to, ask them to show you the recipe. Most people pull these recipes up on their phones in their Brewfather cloud or what have you, and you can look right at the recipe as you're tasting the beer. It's almost impossible to get that same level of recipe to sensory correlation in any other setting than a homebrew club meeting. So it's worth the $30 a year dues just by going to the meetings and tasting beers and looking at recipes. In fact, get into the habit, print out the recipe and just put it on the table right next to the sample. So people can satisfy their curiosity or just take a look and see what's in that beer. Maybe they used an interesting malt that you've never heard of before or you've never used before, and now you get to taste it in that beer. So that's the secret sauce. The other recipe tweaking concept I like to talk about often is just considering brewing smaller batch sizes. If, there's this concept of constantly scaling up your batch size so that you can get more beer for the same amount of effort. But let me flip that upside down. If you brew smaller batches, you're going to brew more often. You'll get more practice at modifying your recipes and you'll become a better brewer faster. The other thing is split batch experimentation. Something I've been doing for the last 5 years or so is almost never brewing a single batch and not splitting it. So you want to split your batch into multiple small fermenters. You end up with a couple results, whether it be different yeasts or different fermentation temperatures or whatever topic interests you, then split your batches, get a bunch of different results in a single brew day. Another way of thinking about that is to just master fewer styles. So just keep rebrewing it until it's exactly how you want it. A couple people in my club specifically are like the masters of certain styles, and it's not by accident. It's usually because they really like that beer or their goal was to perfect it no matter how long it took. So it's a concept that definitely works. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is just the fact that if you want to get really good at this stuff, you should record a lot of data about it. And we talked about, what you did on every given batch or what have you. But if you also think of it in the big picture sense, if you put your recipes into competitions, for example, keeping a really good log or a spreadsheet in the case of what I'm showing you, this is my competition beers spreadsheet. And I track things like the year of the competition, the name, the style of beer, the category, my beer name, and some of the competition notes. So prior to the competitions, and I'll write notes about how I think they're stacking up against each other. Then I track how it scores and what it places, and then make some post notes about what the judge may have said about it and whether I agree with it or not. It's like a dashboard that becomes more and more valuable the longer you keep the data. You can see an example of all of my Martin entries and how some of them made it into competition and some of them didn't, and I tweak my recipes accordingly. Anyway, this is getting really long, and I hope it was of some value to you. Of course, if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email at bobby@brewhardware.com or leave a message on this video. All right, happy recipe designing.